Oh, that's good, Jim. If we've got that recorded, I'm going to use that as a soundbite. The core of the gospel is the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. I want to say thank you, a really big thank you to Grace Fellowship and the Christian Thinker Society for partnering with the Bible Seminary to bring this 8-day experience to you guys. How many of you have been through the exhibit already? Pretty awesome, right? And we're trusting God that a lot of lives are going to be touched, a lot of minds are going to be changed, and a lot of conversions are going to take place during these 8 days. We wanted to add in these 3 90-minute seminars to allow those of you who are really hungry and you want to go deeper to go deep with us. And so I have been assigned the task of crucifixion, dealing with the aspect of death. And so that's where I want to focus my talk this afternoon. The history of crucifixion is fascinating. It begins with the Persians in the 6th century BC. The Persians began to impale people. And you can see on the screen behind me the world's largest toothpicks. And they are run through the abdomen or the pelvic region of these men who are being executed. This is at Lachish. So they're being impaled or hung on poles. Now, over time, this develops, and they begin to attach a crossbar, later called a patibulum, to this, and to tie and nail people to this in what would resemble what we know as crucifixion. The practice spreads by Alexander the Great, and by the Roman times, it has become standard practice. Altogether, 650 years, crucifixion is going to become the primary means of execution. Because of its excessive brutality, it is exactly what they are looking for in the ancient world. Finally, after the conversion of Constantine in 313, a couple of decades later, he outlaws crucifixion. The fact that many of you today are wearing crosses either around your neck or on your ears or tattooed on your arms or wherever is really a shocking thing, because in the first century, which there's nothing wrong with it, I'm all for it, by the way, but I'm just saying in the first century, people who had seen crucifixions, it was such a repulsive act. The idea that I would be wearing a symbol of it would be hard to stomach, if you will. Now, crucifixion was a prevalent method of capital punishment in the first century BC and the first century AD, what we would call the Julio-Claudian and the Flavian dynasties. And according to the historians Josephus and Seneca, the Romans experimented with various types of crucifixion techniques. They reserved crucifixion, watch this, for the most despicable classes of people. I think you're going to see yourself on this list. Slaves, criminals, dishonored soldiers, non-citizens, and there you got it, Christians. Yeah, that's right, you Christians, you're a big problem because you're atheists, you are cannibals, and you are incestuous. That's right. Those were the claims of the Romans against the early Christians. They were atheists because they didn't believe in the gods. They were incestuous because brothers and sisters were married, like she's my sister, but now we're married. They couldn't quite figure that one out. And there were cannibals, this whole thing of eating my flesh and drinking my blood, or you have no part of me. The secular mind just couldn't comprehend this. And this was the pretense for crucifying Christians wholesale, starting in the time of Nero and going forward. The greatest Christian hymn that we have comes to us from the New Testament itself, Philippians chapter 2, verses 5 through 11. Chris Tomlin is from the Woodlands, and man, do I love his music. But I wish he would have checked with us before he wrote that earliest Christian hymn last year that became so popular, because that's not actually the earliest Christian hymn. The earliest Christian hymn goes like this: "Let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus, who being in the form of God thought it not robbery to be equal with God. But he humbled himself and took upon himself the form of a servant, and became obedient unto death, even death on a cross. Therefore God has highly exalted him and given him a name that is above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee would bow, every tongue would confess that Jesus Christ is Lord." Dying a slave's punishment, servile supplicium. In the Roman mind, how could a God possibly die a slave's death? But it was that very gospel, all of us who were once enslaved, that we could relate to, that the God of the universe had come down and died in our place to free us from the bondage of slavery. In these next two slides, you'll see the core of my peer-reviewed research on crucifixion, first dealing with the chronological distribution of crucifixion with nails. Not everyone who was crucified was nailed to a cross. Some were only tied to crosses, some were nailed, some it was both. To my shock last March, Christianity Today, a once great periodical founded by Billy Graham, ran an article that there was no evidence that Jesus had been nailed with nails to the cross. I thought, my goodness, have you never read? Have you never read the Gospels? Clearly, according to the Gospels, unless that's not good enough for you, Jesus was nailed with nails. There were hundreds of thousands of crucifixions over 6 centuries. In some cases, we know their names and we have their physical remains that we have been able to examine. And of those, I have charted the ones crucified by nails, and look at what happens in the 1st century AD. Look what happens to the numbers. They soar in the 1st century AD. Something is taking place geopolitically and in the zeitgeist of that time. Now keep that in mind as we look at the next slide. The geographical distribution. We have all the crucifixions from the 1st century, and we have 30 Roman provinces. 20 under the emperor's control, 10 under the Senate's control. You would expect that approximately they would be distributed evenly among the provinces, but that's not the case. 1 out of every 3 crucifixions in the 1st century are taking place in one province, and that province is Roman Judea. Now let's take those two images, chronologically and geographically, and do you see where they come together? Remember the words of the Apostle Paul in Galatians 4:4. In the fullness of time, God sent his Son into the world, into a time and into a place where he was certain to be crucified with nails. Now, the Roman motivation for crucifixion is clear. Quintilian puts it this way: Romans are crucifying at the busiest roads to maximize visibility and instill maximum fear. For us, that would be at I-10 and 99 right here. We're going to get you to the place where the most people are going to see this so that our message is getting out. If you get sideways with Rome, this may be your fate as well. This comports very well with John 19:20, which says that there were passers-by at the crucifixion. This is by design. You don't want to waste a good execution. It wasn't just individuals who were being crucified. You had mass crucifixions. Look at this list. 6,000 gladiators and slaves in the famous Spartacus revolt. 6,000. That is a staggering number of people in one day. The amount of wood and the number of nails. 800 captives executed by the Hasmonean king Alexander Jannaeus, and this is while he's out publicly partying with his concubines, and among these 800, these are primarily Pharisees. Now, I know Jesus didn't have a lot of good things to say about the Pharisees in Matthew 23, but at least they were people of the book. They were people of the synagogue. They were people of Scripture. I mean, the Sadducees were far worse. I mean, most of these were They were essentially pagans. They were political Roman appointees who were holding this religious office. Alexander Jannaeus executes 800 in one day. 2,000 Jews crucified by the Roman general Quintilius Varus just before the birth of Christ, and 500 Jews daily during the Great Revolt from AD 66 to 70. Now, the act of crucifixion itself is horrific. Most men, and I say men because women were not crucified, most men who were crucified were not scourged before they were crucified. This was only in extreme cases, such as in the case of Jesus of Nazareth. And in the case of Jesus, he is stripped naked. A quaternion consisting of 4 men begin to enact the horror upon his physical body. These are 20-somethings. The head of the team is called the exactor mortis, or the death master. And so with a Roman flagrum, as you'll be able to see in our exhibit, one on one side and one on the other, with Jesus in the middle. As the flagrum comes across, it wraps around the body, so the wounds are on the back and on the front. It's from the back of his head to the bottom of his feet, over 700 wounds. When it wraps around, it destroys the genitalia in the process. And this horrific act is being carried out as one lays the flagrum down, instantaneously the other is swinging. So it's back and forth with no time to breathe. By the time it's over, the ribs are exposed. In some cases, the organs are exposed. The buttocks is torn up, the back of the legs, the back of the head, and the genitalia. Seneca puts it this way. I can see crosses over there. They're all different. Different makers have different designs. Some hang the victim's head down. Others drive a spike through his pelvis. Others stretch out a victim's arms on a forked traverse beam. You see, it turns out almost everything we thought we knew about crucifixion based on medieval art is wrong. No one had ever seen anyone crucified in the Byzantine period or the medieval period. So what I did is I went back to the biblical accounts, to the anthropological evidence that we have, and then the earliest 1st, 2nd, and 3rd century accounts and artistic accounts from people who had actually seen crucifixions to put together the true picture of crucifixion. Now, the Romans used a lot of different types of crosses. In Roman Judea, you most commonly have the T-shaped or the tau cross and the Latin cross, but there were exceptions. There were other types that they would use from time to time. They would even have contests occasionally to see what creative ways they could use to nail people to the cross. If you've ever been told that in the 1st century they were nailing people to poles or to posts, it wasn't until after the time of Constantine. That is totally against the historical record. Now, this next scene that you're going to look at, there are some things correct, there are some things incorrect. And we see, for example, the cross. This is correct. It's about 9 to 10 feet high. That stipes or staticulum, the vertical beam, stays in the ground. It's about 18 inches to 2 feet in the ground. That never comes out. It's the patibulum or the cross beam that is taken in and out, so that when someone like Jesus is nailed to that cross beam, they then raise the patibulum and connect it to the staticulum. We can almost hear the words of Jesus, can't we? As Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so the Son of Man will be lifted up and draw all men unto him. So the cross is correct. The titulus crucis is correct. Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews, in multiple languages. Jesus has a helmet of thorns, which is correct. You'll see this in our exhibit. 29 wounds on the scalp area we see on the man in the shroud. Jesus has a helmet of thorns, reminding us that he has removed the curse from humanity. After the fall in the Garden of Eden, the Bible says the earth began to bring forth thorns. It's the symbol of the curse. Jesus takes that upon himself, breaking the curse off of humanity. All we have to do is receive his sacrifice. But there are a lot of things that are not right in this picture. Jesus should be naked. Jesus should be unrecognizable. By this point, he's been hit repeatedly with fists in the face, according to the Bible. He's been slapped in the face repeatedly. He's been hit on the head with rods repeatedly at this point. His beard has been partially plucked out. He is dehydrated, he is in shock, and he is concussed. He falls under the weight of the patibulum and is assisted by Simon of Cyrene to carry it the rest of the way to Calvary. Now, death normally takes days, and they do this on purpose. And this is why in Roman Judea, you don't normally crucify on a Friday, because you've got the whole Shabbat problem. So for sundown on Friday, we've got to have these people off the cross. And we Romans want them up there for days if possible. We want the birds picking at them while they're still alive. We want people gawking at them, sending out this horrific public message. 4 hours to 4 days, let's keep them up there as long as we can. You're not only going to avoid crucifixion on a Friday normally, but certainly on the Friday before Passover, because this is a high holy day. We can't have people hanging on crosses. It's got to be over real fast. This is why the Bible's very clear. John lays it out, doesn't he? 9 a.m. he's nailed to the cross. 3 p.m. he dies. 6 hours on the cross. What John doesn't tell you, because he assumes that we're going to know this, is that 9 a.m. is the time of the morning sacrifice when Joseph Caiaphas is standing in the temple offering the Paschal lamb. Jesus is being nailed to the cross. 6 hours later, we have the evening sacrifice, and this is when Jesus takes his last breath, fulfilling to the letter all the prophecies of the Passover lamb. Jesus has already died because of the scourging. The men next to him, however, are still alive. They weren't scourged. So what do? It's called crucifixion. They come and they snap their legs. Can you imagine the brute force required to snap a man's tibia and fibia? It would require something like a baseball bat with all of your might to smash those bones. I'm going to show you an example of some broken shin bones in just a moment. We have 6 victims who were crucified with nails. And I'm going to show you some evidence of these from Jerusalem and from the other side of the Mediterranean as well. And then we'll try to bring this back together and juxtapose it with the biblical text. All right, this is the Abba tomb in the Givat HaMiftar neighborhood in East Jerusalem. I knew there was a famous burial here in 1968 when they built their home. They discovered this tomb with this famous inscription of the last Jewish king before the Romans took over, Antigonus Mattathias. So last June, I went and I knocked on their door. The De La Rosa family lives there. They're Sephardic Jews, so I knew they spoke Spanish. So they answered the door, and I spoke to them in Spanish and said, "Hi, you don't know me. My name is Scott. Could I please come through your house and into your backyard? I'd really like to see this tomb in your backyard." And they very graciously allowed me to do that, and they were remodeling. That's why there's 2x4s lying around. But they allowed me to come to see the tomb that I wanted to see, the remains of Antigonus Mattathias. In the next slide, you can see some of the anthropological remains. These nails have human bones still adhering to them. These are crucifixion nails. They're 1st century BC. The mandible and adjacent vertebra have chop marks. Now, this is very interesting because according to Josephus, Mark Antony gives the order to crucify and behead Antigonus Mattathias. And here we have anthropological evidence in this tomb with an inscription to support it that he is both beheaded and crucified. You can see the dots where the nails would normally go in the hand. That is not what you see in medieval art. 100% of the time in medieval art, you're going to see right through the palm of the hand, but it's really between the radius and the ulna or in Destet's spot that the nails will end up going. The next one is, I think, probably the most interesting example. This is a man named Yehohanan, and he is crucified under Pontius Pilate. So if you are looking for a close corollary of Jesus of Nazareth, this is it. This is this is actually the repaired heel bone in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. Notice the hook on the end of the nail. It has apparently hit a knot, and they've decided to just leave it in there. It goes through the calcaneus, the outside of the heels, which is what we had long suspected. Not through the overlapped dorsum, but through the calcaneus, and this is under Pontius Pilate. Now, in the next slide, you can see what they also found with it was a washer, an olive wood washer to help pin the foot on the outside of the cross. So let me make sure you're getting this. The cross is between the feet, and the nails are from the outside in through the calcanei, pinning him to the cross with the help of a washer. They don't want the victim writhing on the cross and then coming loose where they're going to have to repeat their gruesome work. In the next slide, you see Yehohanan's arms and legs, his radius and ulna. Now, this is the anthropological analysis of Israel Hershkovitz, professor at University of Tel Aviv. He's not a Christian, okay? So this isn't some sort of Christian propaganda or spin here. He is saying that right here between the radius and the ulna, you can see where the nail has damaged the bone and that's where he was nailed. When you see the Shroud of Turin exhibit, I want you to look very carefully at where the nails were, right between the radius and the ulna, and where the blood flow is from the heels through the calcanei. Now, most interesting to me are the leg bones, the shin bones of Yehohanan. They are snapped, according to Hershkovitz. Does that ring a bell with anyone? Very rarely would the Romans do this because they want to leave him on the cross as long as possible. They would only try to shorten this if it were on a Friday, and they normally didn't crucify on Fridays. I'm suggesting to you that very few people actually had their legs snapped, and especially under Pontius Pilate, even fewer. Perhaps you're looking at one of the thieves on the cross. Jesus said to one of them, "Today you will be with me in paradise." Who knows, maybe you'll run into Yehohanan in heaven. In 2007 in Gavello, Italy, another crucifixion victim's remains were found. The nails were not in them, but it was clear from the calcaneus bone that the nail had gone through the exact same spot that Yehohanan's nail had passed. So now we were onto something. Both sides of the Mediterranean, nailed through the calcaneus. And so these are all recent examples. Who knows what we're going to find in the next decades? But this was beginning to establish a pattern. Then 10 years later in Finstanton, England, we have another example through the calcaneus, through the same spot with the nail still in it. At this point, we're pretty confident that we're now understanding how and where the Romans nailed and where Jesus of Nazareth was likely nailed as well. Now, I have a little experiment for you. Those of you who were here last week, you've done this experiment before. But even if you have, play along with me. I would like for all of you who are capable to put your foot in your lap, please. Raise your foot to your lap. And I want, no judgment-free zone. If you can't get your foot in your lap, it's okay. I want you to find that spot. Feel around and push down until you find that spot. And when you find it, say, ouch. You found it pretty quickly, didn't you? Now feel around that spot and you're not going to have any pain. It's only that spot. That is the nerve center of your heel. That is the spot that I've been showing you where they're crucifying these people, through the nerve center, through the calcaneus. Now importantly, they're not breaking the heel bone, they're penetrating the heel bone. It's a spongy bone material that doesn't break if it's penetrated just right. My final example comes from Caiaphas himself, the famous Caiaphas ossuary. You can see his name inscribed here on the side of this. We have a replica next door in our museum. The most interesting thing to me is that outside of his ossuary, and by some accounts even a nail inside of his ossuary, we have crucifixion nails with human bones still adhering to it. A couple of months ago, I had a Zoom call with the archaeologist who excavated this tomb to confirm the facts of this. And yes, indeed, there were crucifixion nails on the outside and maybe even on the inside. Now, your mind should be spinning like, you got to be kidding me. Why would Caiaphas or any other Jew have crucifixion nails outside? That's barbaric. That's grotesque. Anyone who's seen crucifixion. They have a warped apotropaic idea of how you keep evil spirits away. And because these nails have taken life, they now have power themselves. And there are hundreds of examples of this. Let's look quickly at some examples outside the Bible, some literary examples that establish the existence and the death of Jesus in the first century. So this isn't just Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Josephus says that Jewish leaders delivered Jesus to Pilate for crucifixion. Marabar Serapion says the same thing. He refers to Jesus as a wise Jewish king. Tacitus, the Roman historian, says Christ was executed as a criminal by Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius. It's exactly what you read in the New Testament Gospels. Lucian mocks Jesus in his critique of Peregrinus, the man who was crucified in Palestine. In the New Testament itself, we have 66 references to crucifixion. 57 of them are unique. In other words, the synoptic gospel writers are not repeating each other here. 57 unique references. 20 New Testament writings mention Jesus' crucifixion, and 5 of the remaining 7 are only one chapter long, like Philemon or 2 John or 3 John. Suffice it to say, crucifixion is the central message of the New Testament. If we don't have a vicarious and atoning death, we don't have Christianity. It's as simple as that. Now, the nudity is a painful topic to talk about, but we should touch on this. The Gospels don't mention Jesus wearing clothing. They only note that the soldiers took his garments. Seneca mentions that some crucifixions involve driving a nail through the pelvis, which suggests that the victims were naked. Melito of Sardis, a 2nd century BC, writes a powerful poem. Oh, unprecedented murder, unprecedented crime. The sovereign has been made unrecognizable by his naked body and has not even allowed a garment to keep him from view. That is why the luminaries turned away and the day was darkened, so that he might hide the one stripped bare upon the tree. No historical evidence supports the use of loincloths. That's for later Christian modesty purposes. But I think it's important for us to grapple with this. In a world dealing with sexual addictions and sexual perversions, I think we must grapple with the fact that Jesus experimented the destruction of his genitalia. His nakedness was exposed to forgive sexual sin and to break sexual addictions. Now, the implication of his nakedness is most overt in John 19:23 and 24, that notes that after dividing Jesus' clothes, the quaternion threw lots for his chitona, his innermost garment. Now, if you're only wearing one garment, that's your chitona. If you're wearing 2, the innermost is your chitona. So if they're taking his innermost garment, obviously he's naked. And underwear doesn't exist until modern times, okay, in case you didn't know that. That's for free. So he's clearly then naked. Nudity was an intentional and strategic part of punishment and carried a strong and readily recognizable public message of shame. Speaking of which, I will show you now something you'll never see in church again. I'm often asked by my students, what did the Romans use for toilet paper? Okay, well, here you go. They used sponges. And so everyone carried his or her own sponge. And so if you were leaving the house, you always carry your sponge with you. And in public bathhouses, there's running water where more or less you can clean these sponges. I bring this up to remind you that when Jesus is on the cross, it says that the soldiers took a sponge attached to a stick. Do you see what they're holding in their hands there? They took a sponge attached to a stick. They poured some wine on it, and Jesus is dying of thirst. I mean, he's extremely hydrated. And they're offering him something to drink. Here, you can have this wine if you're willing to suck it out of this sponge. The shame that Jesus bears on the cross, he bears in our place. Hebrews 12:2 puts it this way: fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer, the archegos and perfecter of our faith. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. None of his bones are broken. The Passover lamb, according to Numbers chapter 9, verse 12, can have none of his bones broken. John the Baptist sees Jesus as the Lamb of God. Paul picks up on this same language when he says, for Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed. Let's look at some artistic examples. The Perrier gem is the oldest. This is in the British Museum. If you travel there today, you can see this bloodstone intaglio. 1st century, T-shaped cross, feet straddling the cross, very consistent with the archaeological examples that I've shown you. Next, we have the Alexamenos graffito from the Palatine Hill in Rome. And here you have a man named Alexamenos, and this is early Christian bigoted graffiti at its finest. We are going to make fun of this stupid guy, Alex, who worships a crucified donkey. And here he is with his arms raised. Alexamenos worships his God. In other words, Christianity is a joke. But in the process, what have they shown us? early 2nd century, probably dating for this, they have shown us a T-shaped cross. They have shown us the heels straddling the cross. And then we have the Puteoli Graffito. A group of my friends from Parkway that are here today were with me when we were in Puteoli recently, when I almost started a riot when they wouldn't let me in to see the Puteoli Graffito. And here you have another example of a crucifixion victim, and he has been scourged. Look at his back. He is flayed, but look at the heels nailed from the outside in. Every example we have is consistent of this. Now, here's the Shroud of Turin, and if you haven't seen the exhibit, you soon will. All the wounds depicted in the gospel seen on the man in the shroud. He goes into the grave. There he's buried, and Dr. Craig Evans is going to come and talk to you now about Jewish burial practices in the late Second Temple period.
Jewish burial traditions, they're not what you think. So let's go to the very first slide, the box. There we go. That's a bird's eye view of a bone box, an ossuary. What are the dimensions? Well, if we had time, I'd do my famous ossuary or bone box dance, but I won't. Yes, it has to be long enough for the femur, has to be deep enough for the rib cage, and of course wide enough for the hip construction. And so, and if you look carefully, you say, wait, I think there's more than one guy in there. Oftentimes, there were 2, 3, 4, 5, even 6 or 7 skeletons. Oftentimes, the skeleton of an infant is placed in an adult ossuary. There are a few real small ossuaries, but the vast majority are made for adults. So let's talk about how they did it. Burial took place the day of death. Here's an example in Luke's gospel where this is presupposed. As he drew near to the gate of the city, burial is always outside the city limits. Behold, a man who had died was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow, and a large crowd from the city was with her. That young man died that day, or perhaps the evening before. So her grief is at its rawest when Jesus meets her. And when Jesus came to the ruler's house, the ruler, please hurry, hurry, my daughter's on the brink of death. When they arrive, the flute players are already playing. The crowd is making a tumult, that is, they're weeping and wailing. The funeral is already underway. It's not like today, where Uncle Fred passes away and the family grieves and gathers, and there's planning, and 3, 4, 5 days later, the funeral takes place. It happens the day of death. Now Archelaus, Josephus the historian, tells us, continued to mourn for 7 days out of respect for his father, Herod the Great. The custom of the country prescribes this number of days, so right away you've learned something new. The primary funeral, the first funeral, is 7 days. That applies to Jesus, so keep that in mind. And then after feasting the crowds and making an end of mourning 1 week after Herod's death, he went up to the temple. The 7 days tradition probably derives from Genesis 50, verse 10, where Joseph the patriarch, the son of Jacob, made a mourning for his father, Jacob, 7 days. And also 1 Samuel 31:13, where, quote, they took their bones, that is, the bones of King Saul and his sons, and buried them under the tamarisk tree in Jabesh, and fasted 7 days. So that's where the custom of 7 days comes from. It's in Scripture. And so what do after the funeral has taken place over the course of 7 days? They come back 1 year later, and this is secondary burial. It's called osculagium, bone gathering. That's what it is. And so this is Jewish law in the Mishnah, tractate Sanhedrin, chapter 6, paragraph 6. When the flesh had wasted away, they gathered together the bones and buried them in their own place. Okay? So the bones could then be gathered up. So here you have a skeleton on a ledge. It's disarticulated and placed either in a box or in a niche. How long after death? 12 months, says the Babylonian Talmud in Tractate Kiddushim. So this is where the tradition comes from. And by the way, it's very important theologically. When you have died and your flesh has disappeared, wasted away, and there's only bones left, your sins are gone. So you may have been executed as a criminal. You may have been denied burial in an honorable site. But after 1 year, your bones can be gathered and taken to a place of honor, your family tomb or whatever. Here is a rabbi telling his son in Simachot, "My son, bury me at first in a niche. In the course of time, collect my bones and put them in an ossuary, but do not gather them with your own hands. So have another family member or servant do that for you." There are ossuaries right there. And by the way, I've chosen these three because they depict three styles. The one on the right, that is a very fancy ossuary. You notice it doesn't work. Anyway, the one on the right has two rosettes. They're very well decorated. And notice the arched lid. The one in the middle has an inscribed name. It's not a bad-looking ossuary. It has feet, but the lid is flat, otherwise rather plain. And then the one on the left is very plain. And so you typically have these three styles: very expensive, fairly cheap, and as cheap as you can be. An ossuary could be a simple one made in a single day. It's made of limestone, very heavy. Made of limestone, usually a rejected stone from all the stonework taking place at the Temple Mount during the days of Herod the Great and his son Archelaus. Over a period of 60-some years, the temple complex was being constructed. There were thousands of square blocks rejected, chopped up usually into 4 pieces or more, and then carved out and made into ossuaries. That's why there are so many. We have found thousands. About 3,500 have been published. About 1/4 of them have names inscribed on them. Very useful for us. And when the tomb robbers have not found the tomb and violated the tomb, we can collect lots of really important information, such as how old people were when they passed away, and in some cases, what caused their death, like tooth infections, common cause of death, parasites, and so forth. We can measure the bones, determine not only how tall the people were, how much musculature they likely had, how good their diets were, if there were any deficiencies. It's fascinating. You'll be surprised to know, on the basis of this analysis, that we have deduced that most people, the average age was only late 20s. You realize that? I should have been dead about 40 years ago. This is amazing what we learned. Men were about 5'5", 5'6", 5'7". Women were 4'10", 4'11", maybe 5 feet tall. Men weighed a robust 145 pounds. Women often weighed 90 to 95 pounds. So we are big people today compared to them. We learn all of this. And by the way, most of them had pretty good teeth, which is really interesting too. All right. And in some cases, we can tell their diet, the roughage, the ground grain, ground on stone, put stone fragments in their bread and wore their teeth down. We can actually deduce that as well. But this is something you probably don't know. It was believed that when you died, your spirit didn't depart right away, but hung around for 3 days. In a commentary on Leviticus, it says, for 3 days after death, the soul hovers over the body, intending to re-enter it. But as soon as it sees its appearance change, in another text we're told the face is no longer recognizable, then the spirit departs. Isn't that interesting? Now, what do we learn from some of these traditions for understanding the New Testament? On one occasion, Jesus asks a young man to follow him and be a disciple. And he says, well, he seems interested, but let me first go and bury my father. And Jesus retorts, as you see on the screen. Oops, wait a minute. We're out of... Yeah, okay. Let the dead bury their own dead. Now, some have wondered, well, that was rather insensitive. Jesus talks about how important burial is, especially how important it is to love your parents and take care of them. He rebukes Pharisees for neglecting that because of some of their vows. So what is he saying here? Well, we believe that he's referring not to primary burial. He's not referring to a father who is ill on his deathbed, who might pass away any day now, but rather he's referring to a young man concerned about his father's anniversary coming up. He died last year, and I have to rebury. I have to collect the bones of my father and put them in an ossuary or in a niche. And Jesus is saying to him, let the dead take care of their dead. He's already dead. His bones are in the family tomb with relatives. Let them stay together. You need to preach the kingdom of God to the living. But especially, look how the light is shed on the conversation in John chapter 11, where the two sisters, Mary and Martha, are grieving for Lazarus who has died. Oh, they say to Jesus, if you had just come sooner when he was still alive, you may have been able to save him. But now it's too late. He is dead. And so Jesus then tells them, I am the resurrection and the life. And he's going to demonstrate it. So they go to the tomb, and Jesus commands them to roll aside the stone. And someone objects, but he's been dead 4 days. Have you ever wondered what that meant? Now, on one level, it's obvious. If he's been dead 4 days, it isn't going to smell good, and the chances of revival are rather slim. But I told you a moment ago that there was the belief that the spirit hovered near the body for 3 days. On the fourth day, the spirit doesn't recognize the body anymore and departs. So the only way anybody can be raised up now is through resurrection. And that's why it's essential in the context that it's noted that Lazarus has been dead for 4 days. And that's why Jesus says, I am the resurrection and the life. And so he proves he really is the resurrection and the life when he commands Lazarus, Lazarus come forth, and he comes forth. And by the way, the grave clothes are removed. Jesus says you have to unbind him. And that actually is germane for the discussion we've already had about grave clothes and so on, including a burial shroud. And so this is actually a very relevant passage even for that topic. So let's go to the Last Supper scene. That's in 2 slides. There we go. That's very good. Now, here's another passage where I think understanding Jewish burial traditions help us and make a lot of sense. The woman anoints Jesus' head or feet in another context, another time, but I'm talking about here in Mark and also in Matthew. And Jesus says she's anointed my body beforehand. And we get lost in some of the details, and you can look up the whole passage. It's Mark 14, 3 through 9. The disciples think it's a waste. This was expensive ointment and perfume. Why, it could have been sold for a lot of money, and we're going to need money. We have a ministry that will include ministering to the poor. Why this waste? And of course, I think the disciples come across like real oafs in this situation and embarrassing this woman who has made a sacrificial gift. This is probably her retirement. It represents her savings. This is very valuable, what she has done. And then here they are complaining about it. Well, I think it's a messianic anointing on her part. And what she's doing is exorbitant. She could have taken oil, olive oil, which isn't very expensive, and anointed Jesus' head with that. That's what Samuel the prophet does with King David. So why this extravagance? Why this expensive ointment? Now, I don't think she is thinking of Jesus' body being anointed for burial. That's not what she's thinking about, but that's how Jesus takes it. So he says, leave her alone. She's done a beautiful thing. She's anointed my body beforehand for burial. What does that imply? Not only that Jesus will die soon, but if he dies as a criminal, he may be denied that kind of ministration. That is, his body might not be washed and perfumed and wrapped. Rather, it might be tossed into a tomb very unceremoniously. Because if you're executed as a criminal, public mourning is denied. Your body can't be placed in a place of honor like the family tomb. Rather, it is reserved for tombs for criminals who are executed. That is likely what happened to the two men whose shin bones had to be broken, as Scott explained earlier. They likely ended up in tombs reserved for criminals. But Jesus had already died, and Joseph of Arimathea takes his body down and places him in a tomb not yet used. Neither honorable nor dishonorable, the body can be placed there. And so Jesus is hinting at his fate. He's going to die soon, and as a criminal, and who knows what kind of treatment his body might receive. And I'm sure that is not what the lady who did this nice thing intended. Well, Jesus is put to death, as Scott has already described. It is an awful way to be whipped and beaten and then nailed to a cross like this. And Jesus dies in about a 5 to 6 hour time frame, and by 3 p.m., he is seen to be dead. Well, the disciples or the family or whatever can't simply take his body down. You have to get permission. And we actually have papyri from Egypt, and most of our papyri, almost all of it, comes from Egypt because of the weather, the dry sands, and so on. And we have 500,000 pages of papyri from Egypt from classical antiquity. So it's a treasure trove, and it's not all published yet, only about 10% of it. And I've seen papyri that actually, where you have people asking permission for bodies to be released, asking permission for this or that relating to burial, including price lists on how expensive perfume and burial shrouds are. So we know a lot of things about this. So Joseph of Arimathea, who belongs to the Sanhedrin, who in fact did not vote with the majority to have Jesus condemned, he then goes to Pilate. Caiaphas and company don't care, but Joseph does, and Pilate asks the centurion to confirm that Jesus is dead. He does that because crucifixion victims often don't die the very day they're crucified. So he receives word that, yes, he is dead. Okay, they can take the body down. And at that point, Rome loses interest. Now, Matthew's gospel does tell us that the normal custodial supervision at tombs reserved for criminals is bolstered by an actual armed guard. The fear is that a crowd of disciples might rally around the tomb of Jesus, weep and wail and make a lot of noise, maybe even call for a change in government. Who knows? There will be none of that. And so Jesus' body is then placed in a temporary grave. A year later, his family can collect his remains and take them back up to Nazareth if they want, or bury them in Bethlehem where he has relatives, or whatever they want to do. That would be the rule. So Joseph took the body, wrapped it in a clean linen shroud, which is what we've been looking at, and laid it in his own new tomb, which he had hewn in the rock, and he rolled a great stone to the door of the tomb and departed. So it was just a hole until Jesus' body went in it and then it became a tomb. The late Rachel Haklili in Israel explained that to me and my grad students. There is no such thing as a tomb until a body has been placed in it. And so there was no crime, there was nothing wrong in placing the body of Jesus in this particular hole that hadn't been used yet. Now, here's what I want to share with you in my final 10 minutes. Roman law, not just Jewish law, but Roman law protected burial. This is the so-called Nazareth inscription. It was purchased in Nazareth, not found in Nazareth, and we don't think it ever was posted in Nazareth, but it's an imperial decree saying, do not tamper with tombs. It was purchased from an antiquities collector in 1878 by a very eccentric French collector of antiquities who didn't allow it to be published until after he died in 1925. It was published in 1930, and we call it the Nazareth inscription, and that's its official designation. SEG just means it's a collection of Greek inscriptions. It's in volume 8. It is number 13. And that's the actual stone. We have a replica of it next door in our museum at TBS. Here's part of what it says. It is my pleasure that graves and tombs remain unmolested in perpetuity. If any person has transferred bodies to other places, let no one remove them for any reason. If this ordinance is violated, I will that the charge of tomb robbery be laid. And by the way, tomb robbery can be a capital offense and result in your execution. So the body of Jesus could not be buried in his family tomb, at least not for 1 year, though this period of time was sometimes shortened. After 1 year or so, his family would be allowed to gather his bones and rebury them in the family tomb. And so when the women show up Sunday morning, why then? Well, let's think it through. Jesus dies Friday afternoon. There is just time to get permission from Pilate, take the body down, obtain a linen shroud and some ointments, quite a lot of ointments according to John's gospel, purchased by Joseph and Nicodemus, and then take all of that body, shroud, and ointments to the tomb before sundown. You want that body, and that would apply to the other two men who died with Jesus. You want those bodies out of sight in tombs before sundown. The law of Moses commands it, and the Romans allowed, we are told by Josephus, Roman authority permitted that. And of course, you want to get home before dark. I know it sounds kind of funny, but there weren't street lights, and you don't want to be in a cemetery at night. There's the fear of corpse impurity. You might step in the wrong place, and oh no, Passover celebration is tonight, and I just walked over a grave. And there was the fear of evil spirits and ghosts and things like that. So Jesus' body has been placed in a tomb. So when can you go back to the tomb and continue with the primary funeral? Well, not Saturday morning. That's Shabbat. The Sabbath begins Friday evening. It doesn't end until Saturday evening. So do you go Saturday night? No, you stay away from cemeteries in the dark. So the first opportunity legally and in terms of the holiday, Passover, and in terms of safety, is Sunday morning. So at first light, the women arrive at the tomb, and what do they find? The stone has been pulled back. Now, the stone we think was probably round, but it is interesting. We now believe that over 90% of the stones look like the one you see on the right, square, like a plug. But Jesus' stone over his tomb probably was round, and so wasn't pulled away, but was rolled away. And the women arrive, and where's Jesus? Now, it's interesting to note that their assumption was not resurrection, but his body had been removed. Why? It could be Caiaphas, the high priest, found out what Joseph of Arimathea did, and he didn't like it. He wanted Jesus' body to be in with the rest of the criminals in a place of dishonor. So what, they wouldn't know. And then, of course, Simon Peter and the beloved disciple arrive at the tomb, and this is John chapter 20, and Peter goes in first, and then John, we think, is John, the beloved disciple. He enters the tomb, and what do they see? Linen wrappings, the shroud, and other wrappings, plus the face cloth, but no body. Now, in a minute, this is going to mean a lot more to you. Discovery of the open and empty tomb would have dismayed the women, especially Mary, the mother of Jesus, for this would mean that the body of Jesus had been relocated. Sunday was the beginning of the third day. So how much longer do they have before the face can't be recognized, according to their tradition? If they don't find the body by the end of Sunday, Monday is too late. Is this Jesus or is this one of the other guys? That's the fear. That's what they're thinking. They're not thinking, oh boy, he's been resurrected. That hasn't occurred to them yet until Jesus appears to Mary and then to other disciples. So that if Jesus' body isn't found, it'll never be identified. Now, let's go on to this next slide. This is new. It's new to me, too. I was looking for a papyrus that talked about something else. And this is a French journal from 1865, and I'm scanning through it. It's online. And I run across papyrus number 63, and in the French, it says a report of a tomb violation. Well, I knew this was coming up, and I thought, oh man, I've got to read this. Wow, it was fascinating. So I'm going to give you some of it. This is the first public presentation relating to this text ever, as far as I know. So here's how it goes. To Dionysus, one of my friends, Hipparch, it means the officer of horse. So he'd be basically the rank, a cavalry captain. Hipparch over the men, and chief guardian of the district of Thebes. That means Thebes, but the neighborhoods around Thebes. This is in Egypt. From Osiraius, son of Horus, a priest of the Memnonia. This guy's upper middle class. I inform you that in the 44th year, and that's where we get our date 104 BC, when Locus, my relative, came to Diospolis Magna, certain persons invaded one of the tombs belonging to me in the district of Thebes. Having opened it, they stripped some of the bodies that were buried there, and at the same time took away all the belongings I had placed there, amounting to the sum of 10 talents of copper. It also happened that because the door was left wide open after they left, some bodies that were in good condition suffered greatly at the hands of wolves, which partially devoured them. Since I am bringing a lawsuit against these guys, blah, 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 blah. This is amazing. This is tomb robbery, but notice, the bodies weren't taken. The linen shrouds were. Why? Because they're valuable. And these bodies were in good condition, which means they hadn't been in the tomb very long. And so these thieves said, oh, good, we'll take this, oh, look, these shrouds are, unwrap these guys. And they took the shrouds. That is really interesting. So I do want to publish this with some detailed commentary on it, but this has implications. Next slide. This has implications. Next slide. It has. Next slide. Sorry, I guess I got a little bit ahead of you. Yeah, this. Let's read John 20, verse 8. And there you see it up there. Stooping to look in, he saw the linen cloths lying there, but he did not go in. Then Simon Peter came, following him, and he went into the tomb. He saw the linen cloths lying, and the napkin which had been on his head, not lying with the linen cloths, but rolled up in a place by itself. Then the other disciple who reached the tomb first also went in, and he saw and believed. He realized this is weird. Grave thieves don't unwrap bodies. and then carry the body away and leave the valuable linen shroud. So let that soak in. You're the first to hear about this. The beloved disciple realized no thief would do this. The only explanation is that Jesus has been raised up. And there's something else. I'm really speculating here. What if he, in the darkness of that tomb, could see a glowing image in the cloth? The image is still hot. I don't know. I'm speculating, but that would send him through the roof. Jesus' followers spoke of resurrection because not only did Jesus appear to them, but the tomb was empty. His body wasn't there. I debated John Dominic Crossan one time, said, it was just the spirit of Jesus. I said, Dom, you're turning Easter into Halloween. Easter is not a ghost story. And I'll stop there with a few seconds to spare. Thank you very much.
Well done, Professor Evans. Thank you all for being here. What an incredible crowd for this symposium. I'm delighted to be participating. And let me just say hello to those that are also joining as well later in the week. I'm sorry I couldn't be with you personally, but what an amazing turnout this is at our first symposium of the week. My topic is the best topic, the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And what are the best reasons to believe? What's the best case for the resurrection? And I hope that you're taking notes. The passages that I'll look at in particular are 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 7, Galatians 1, 18 through 19. So we begin in where the resurrection occurred. Go ahead to the next slide, please. This is inside the church of the Holy Sepulchre. Now, raise your hand if you've been to Israel before. Raise your hand if you've been to Israel. We've got a great group that's been. Many people who go to Israel, especially if you're evangelical, feel robbed because they never visit the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. They always go to what's called Gordon or the Garden Tomb. The Garden Tomb is a wonderful place. It's a devotional place. Every tour I lead, I would absolutely stop there. The only problem is that's not where Jesus' resurrection occurred. It happened in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Even the director of the Garden Tomb agrees with me on that. And you're looking at this, isn't that a beautiful picture? So we're inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and that is what's called the edicule. That is the little house, the sacred place that has been built on top of what is left, which is the burial shelf in which Jesus' body was laid. Not too long ago, National Geographic, and there's a beautiful documentary on it that you can watch, where they actually unearthed the burial shelf, and all of it goes back to first century, showing that this is indeed a first century burial quarry. Indeed, I had the privilege, it was a very cool vibe. I actually filmed inside of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which was very cool. And I didn't just film inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, I filmed all around it. I also filmed right next to the very spot where Jesus' body was laid and resurrected. And so let's orient ourselves. This is ground zero for the resurrection, where this is the epicenter of the Christian faith. Without this moment happening, there is no Christianity. There are 300 passages in the New Testament that testify. You heard Dr. Stripling, I think he said 66 passages related to the cross or dying on the cross. We have 300 passages related to the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Now, how many chapters are there in the New Testament? 260. And so when you think about just the magnitude of resurrection, it becomes very clear. We talk a lot about biblical worldview. We talk a lot about having a biblical Christian worldview. The center of a Christian worldview is the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Everything about the Christian worldview emanates out of the fact that Jesus Christ is alive from the dead. Number one, the resurrection, in my opinion, and this is very carefully thought through, ultimately is the only way, the reason I believe Jesus rose from the grave, it's the only way to ultimately make sense of the suffering in our lives. The cross and the empty tomb give suffering a frame that nothing else in human history can provide. Christianity does not attempt to explain away our pain, it redeems our pain. And this is Romans 8:18, which Paul says, I consider the sufferings of this present time are not worth the glory that is to be revealed to us. I'll never forget speaking in Santa Cruz, California, meeting this amazing couple, Dan and Lynn Wagner, who were serving at a beach fest, Luis Palau Evangelistic Rally. And they stopped me and they said, can we share our story with you? And they shared about losing their 2 teenage daughters at the same time in a car accident. And the really cryptic part of the story was Dan, the dad, had been concussed. He had temporary amnesia, and his best friend had to keep telling him because he kept forgetting that his 2 daughters had died in this car wreck. It's a beautiful story of forgiveness because they ended up forgiving the driver of the vehicle who killed both of their daughters instantaneously. And when I interviewed Dan and Lynn, I just said, how do you do it? How do you get through it? They said, Jeremiah, we're not living for the 80 or so years we may have. We're living for the resurrection. We know we will see our daughters, Carrie and Mandy, again. That's the beauty of the resurrection. It helps us in our pain. And make no mistake, no other worldview does. Number 2, very importantly, there are people that wonder, did Jesus really know what he was talking about? What was the aim and the mission of Jesus' life and ministry? Other people made up that he was God, and he didn't really know what he was doing. He was probably married and had a mortgage. I mean, you hear all kinds of crazy stuff, at least I do on these podcasts, I do. The intentionality of Jesus' ministry is undeniable. 69 times he refers to himself with his favorite self-designation in the Synoptics, Son of Man. And to his Jewish audience, Son of Man would immediately visualize Daniel chapter 7 and Jesus reigning at the right hand of God the Father. These are passages you should have memorized. Mark 8:31, Mark 9:31, Mark 10:33 and 34. These are called messianic predictions. That the Son of Man would be handed over to the Romans, he would die, but it doesn't stop there. On the 3rd day, he would rise again. I joke, if the church had a hashtag in the 1st century, it would have been hashtag on the 3rd day. If you don't know what a hashtag is by now, we literally can't help you, and you should just leave the symposium. Because so often Jesus does what only he can do. He messianizes Old Testament passages. He eschatologizes them. I love this. He messianizes Hosea 6:2, which says, on the 2nd day he will revive us. On the 3rd day, that's Hosea 6:2, he will raise us up that we may live before him. Jesus is claiming that passage as his own. So he called it. Do you remember the Great Confession? I spoke from Codex Vaticanus last Sunday at my church, Prestonwood, and I actually taught with the Massive Vaticanus on the pulpit. It was epic, and I had it to the Greek, Matthew 16. Of course, there's no chapter or versification, but there I'm reading the Great Confession that happens at Caesarea Philippi in Matthew 16, where Jesus says, well, who do you say that I am? He said, well, you're the Christ, the Son of God. Jesus then immediately makes a prediction. He has to go to the cross, he has to die, and he has to rise from the dead. And do you remember what Peter does? He pulls Jesus aside. He begins to rebuke him in verse 22. And do you remember what Jesus says in verse 23? Get behind me, who? Satan. So it's very important. Why am I taking time? Why is this one of my cases for the resurrection? There are minimalists and Bible deniers and those that are just atheist, agnostic, apostate Bible scholars who just think that Jesus didn't really know what his ministry was about. There was no intentionality to it. No, there was. The third reason to believe in the resurrection of Jesus is that Jesus adumbrated. That's a cute word. We have kids in the room. Jesus showed that he had power over death by raising others who had ceased to live. This is powerful. Again, these are passages of, I would encourage you, if you care about a Christian worldview, you should have these passages memorized. Mark 5, Jairus' daughter. Remember, she's dead, she's young, and Jesus raises her from the dead. With the widow of Nain's son, I love this passage in Luke 7. He had died that day. Jesus, wouldn't this be amazing? I hope someday we can time travel when when we get to heaven. I want to go to the funeral processional that Jesus stops in its track and says, no, the boy's not dead. He's just sleeping. Arise. Literally, resurrection, anastasis, egeiro, in the Greek, it literally just means to stand up. When Jesus resurrects Lazarus, I have filmed at, I think, all of the resurrection tombs mentioned in the New Testament. I think my favorite after the Holy Sepulchre is when I went to the tomb of Bethany. Scott, I'm sure you've been to Lazarus' tomb and El Atzaria. You probably told me to go there is why I went. Dr. Evans, have you been to Lazarus' tomb, El Atzaria and Bethany? It's interesting. Many have not. It's only 1.8 miles as the crow flies, but a lot of Jews, etc., won't go there for a variety of current issues. So I'm in the tomb. You walk downstairs, and then I don't know if you remember this, Scott, you have to actually back in to the tomb once you get downstairs, and like you can't breathe. I mean, it's definitely a tomb. There's very little oxygen. I'm out of breath, but I thought, I want to do what Jesus did. I want to yell. And I went, Lazarus, come forth, as loud as I could, just to hear my voice echo throughout the chain. Of course, in Benduro Exos, come out, Lazarus. Isn't that amazing that Jesus shouted at death? One of the two places he shouts in the New Testament, one on the cross and then the other at death, and Lazarus comes out alive. So, number 3, Jesus showed he had power over death. Number 4, why do I believe in the resurrection? This is very key. We read modern understandings back into the Bible. This is where things like the Dead Sea Scrolls are so helpful, where we understand messianic expectations of the first century. We have at least 10 messianic contenders in the first century, men who claimed, hey, I'm the Messiah, follow me. We hear of 2 of them in the book of Acts. Do you remember one had a following of 4,000? They guided people out into the desert, etc. But no one, not even his disciples, anticipated a bodily resurrection of any first century Jew, including Jesus' own. These kind of expectations are seen in 4Q 285, where the Messiah is seen to be a conquering. He will kill the Kittim, the Romans. He'll even perhaps kill the Roman emperor. He will cleanse a corrupt temple, he will vanquish a corrupt priesthood, and he will show himself God. So that was the expectation. You might bring up the forbidden chapter of Isaiah 53, but that was not widely held. And that's why we see Peter, even his own disciples, not really understanding what Jesus is talking about. What is all this business that you have to die on the cross? And then we see those passages, very, very important to understand these messianic motivations. This is I think, innovative as well. Dr. Evans and myself recently we co-authored an article called Case for the Resurrection in the Macmillan Interdisciplinary Handbook, Philosophy of Religion textbook. And I believe we have come up with a new argument for the resurrection, because one thing, if you and I were Jews, there is absolutely no psychological motivation to invent a resurrection narrative for Jesus. Jesus is a rabbi, he's a teacher. We can certainly remember him, we can honor him. His teachings can continue through rabbinic tradition. There is no reason to make up a story psychologically. There's no psychological motivation payoff to invent a resurrection narrative, because Judaism is a coherent religion. Certainly all Jews will be resurrected, they believe, at some point in the future, not an individual resurrection. So we point this out, and I think it's a helpful argument because it puts us in the world of the text. Remember, CIA, every time you do Bible study, context, interpretation, application. What's the context? What's the world of the text? Then how do we rightly interpret it based on that context? And then what's the faith lesson to apply to my life? So 4 is a big one for me. Written and archaeological sources support the gospel narrative of resurrection. Dr. Stripling and Professor Evans have both done an amazing job of pointing that out. I can go quickly here, but ancient literary and physical evidence corroborates all of the gospel accounts. As Dr. Evans has already said, we have many scholars, not necessarily all Christians, who say the Gospels get the entire juridical procedure right, death, burial, and resurrection, according to that. And we have these key sources. I have them here in my slides. Dr. Stripling has already reviewed some of these. Number 6, this is very cool for me because Jesus appeared to those who loved him. Jesus appears to those who are indifferent to him. And Jesus appears to those who are hostile to him. How do you explain the conversion of hostile witnesses outside of the resurrection of Christ? Of course, you have Saul of Tarsus, who is converted when he sees the Lord. That's 1 Corinthians 15:8. He has a resurrection experience of seeing Jesus physically alive from the dead, and it left him completely transformed. But I like to talk about James. How many of you have brothers? Raise your hand if you have a brother, so I can see all the brothers in the room. Let me just test the audience. I know you love your brother. I'm sure your brother is the greatest. What would it take for you to believe your brother is the sinless Son of God? People always laugh. I have 4 sons. None of them think the other one is the Son of God. It's anarchy. It's Book of Judges. They all do what's right in their own eyes, especially when Dad's out of town. So we have to ask ourselves the same critical questions of the Bible. We know in Mark 3 and in Mark 6, Jesus' family thinks he's nuts. They think he may even be born. He's accused out of wedlock. He might be, the name for that. We have kids in the room. Not even his brothers believed in him. They think he's out of his mind. They want to do an intervention on him. And John 7 verse 5 is perhaps the clearest. Not even his brothers, plural, believed in him. We all likely, and those of you watching, perhaps the most difficult people to have faith conversations with for whatever reason are our immediate family. Have you noticed that? And Jesus experienced that as well. And yet, 1 Corinthians 15:7, which gives us, we have 2 things when it comes to resurrection. We have empty tomb tradition. So familiarize yourself with all of the empty tomb tradition. But then we also have appearance tradition. Jesus appears. There's 11 different appearance events. What's so amazing, I remember living in England, and I would just have to get out of Oxford on the weekends. It was very stressful. And Lily and Audrey and I would drive places. And we went to Glastonbury Abbey. The big Glastonbury Festival is there every year. Well, that's supposedly the home of King Arthur. And King Arthur is supposed to have lived around 500 AD, and it took 300 to 400 years for all of the legends to emerge of the Knights of the Round Table, Sir Lancelot, King Arthur, etc. It took a few centuries. It took everyone who could have possibly known Arthur dying, and their grandparents and cousins and grandkids, great-grandkids, great-grandkids, and then you have all of these legends emerge about King Arthur. And people try to compare that to our Gospels. What do we have in the New Testament? We have an eyewitness account that's written to the church at Corinth 20 years after the resurrection. 20 years, where Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, in fact, 500 saw him. Many of them are still alive. Go talk to them for yourself. He is challenging us to speak to the eyewitnesses. I love that word eyewitness, autoptes. It's a cognate in English for Luke, who in his beginning 4 verses says, we've had like an autopsy. Autoptes, we have seen these things with our own eyes. Therefore, Theophilus, you can have a certainty about these events. And so that's what explains it. So Jesus then appears to James. And again, I want to time travel. Especially now that I'm a dad of boys. And who knows, James is embarrassed by brother Jesus. He's humiliated the family, died in the way in which Dr. Stripling so wonderfully described. He's probably in the workshop working on a piece of stone, and all of a sudden Jesus appears to him and to James, and he's like, bro, check out my side, bro. Check out my wrist, bro. My calcaneus, whoa, they got me. Something happens. James believes his brother is the resurrected Messiah, so much so that Galatians, remember the passage I gave you in Galatians at the beginning of the talk, James not only becomes a Christian, he becomes a pillar of the church, so much so that he is one in whom Paul must consult to make sure that he has the gospel right. So James, who goes from hostile to believing his brother, who he grew up with, saw everything, was the Messiah. And then not only that, this is actually why I date the book of Acts pre-62, Josephus tells us that James dies, and I don't have time to get into all the details, in AD 62, and he dies believing his brother is the resurrected Son of God. So how do you explain Paul? How do you explain James with the resurrection? The most explanatory power is that Jesus physically, bodily rose from the grave. And that's very, very important because we have, again, Jesus appearing to those who loved him, those who were indifferent to him, and then, of course, his own family and those who were hostile to him. This is what's, oh, by the way, another word on James. He was the pastor of the world's first megachurch, and make sure you get that. There's nothing wrong with large churches. The first church was very large, 10 to 20,000 in Jerusalem. James led that church. This is before persecution caused widespread spreading of the faith, but let's not forget, for 30 years, James anchored a powerhouse of a church that was doing all the things the book of Acts says a big church can do. I love that, and so embrace that, please. Don't have a pious view if you're watching or in this, that there's something wrong with large churches. You wouldn't have liked the first church if that's the case, and you wouldn't have liked James because he was the pastor there. Pretty cool historically. 7, this is a historical fact. I wrote an entire book based on this. The gospel, the resurrection changes lives, that it's the greatest apologetic of our faith, that the resurrection energizes us to actually do something about it in our community. 1 Corinthians 15:58, after 57 magisterial verses on the resurrection, Paul says, therefore, be strong, be vigilant, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing your labor in the Lord is not in vain. So what does that mean? It means because of the resurrection, every single little thing I do for Jesus matters for all eternity. And then verse 16:1, I love this. The very next verse, it goes from 15:58 to chapter 16, verse 1. Paul says, okay, get out your checkbook. We have people suffering. We need to take an offering. So Paul actually goes directly from an argument of resurrection to Christian ethics. Because Jesus is resurrected, we have to go take up an offering, a collection. I'll bring it to those suffering in Jerusalem. So do you see how the resurrection is not only the center of the Christian worldview, it's the key to our Christian ethics. It's why we save babies. It's why we have pregnancy centers. It's why we take care of people old and young. It's why we say every single life has inherent value, that nothing can change the value of humanity. And so where the resurrection is believed and lived out, communities are transformed. There's a fascinating book I talk about in my book Unimaginable called The Plot to Kill God. And it looks at what happened in particular in Russia when they embraced atheistic worldview. Would it surprise you to learn that deaths of despair tripled in Russia when it went atheist? Would it surprise you to learn that suicide rates skyrocketed? Would it surprise you to learn that we are all much more dangerous to ourselves than to other people, and without God, it becomes law of the jungle very quickly? And the equal is true when you look at what we're part of, the capital C Church. We are the greatest force for good on planet Earth. Do you all remember? I was living here during Hurricane Harvey. Does anyone living here during Hurricane Harvey? Do you remember the body of Christ mobilized, the power of the body of Christ mucking out homes, praying with people, seeing people come to Christ, totally beating out FEMA to help people? I mean, that's the power of Jesus. And I often say this, I didn't see a lot of atheist tents during Hurricane Harvey. Did you guys? I'm not saying that atheists can't be charitable. Please don't take it further than it goes. I'm saying the church, because of the resurrection, has a passion to change lives today. That's why we should go on mission trips. We should work as hard as we can. I did our large staff devotional recently, and I was really focusing on the fact that Paul in Colossians 1, because I've been consecrating myself this Easter season. That's a big word. I want to bring back all these old religion words, by the way, because I was raised on them. I have been consecrating, and Audrey too, our family during this Easter season, and I want to give it all for Jesus, don't you? I don't want to give 80%. I don't want to give 60%. I want to give 100%. And I want to tell you, I'm doing that right now. I want to go out with the gas light on, and I want you to as well. The resurrection should energize you. And so my challenge to you is, will you commit to living a resurrection-centric life? That's really the commitment that you need to make. It will energize everything that you do for Christ. Now, I want to skip ahead a few slides. We've already seen the animation. We'll skip ahead from C.S. Lewis's home. We'll also say this. I want to quote Body of Proof that the case against the resurrection of Jesus is usually based, and I give this in this book, on the uniqueness of the claim itself. A man who had been dead for 2 or 3 days, 3 days technically by a Jewish calendar, had been brought back to life. And it's very important that you understand the case against the resurrection is extremely weak. Next slide. This is my new book that they have. Is it called The Gathering? Is that right? Where the shroud is? The Gathering? Did I have that right? So the book is available there. Let me really encourage you to get it as soon as you can, because it will likely run out again on Amazon this week. We have a big week of ministry planned. For those that weren't here this morning, my kids challenged me, Dad, tell us everything we can know about Jesus and the resurrection, but you can't use the Bible. You just have to use extra biblical sources. And it turns out I could write a whole book to answer them. So there's that, kids. And at this one, I had to pay off so many archaeologists. Scott, you know the feeling, to get pictures and permissions. I actually loved it. It was a total labor of love doing it, but I'm actually glad now, because as I talk about these discoveries, there's some phenomenal photos. Definitely use that. Let's quote E.P. Sanders. Let's quote some of the critics on the resurrection and see what they have to say. The late E.P. Sanders, died in 2022, said that Jesus' followers and later Paul had resurrection experiences is, in my judgment, a fact. Now, what the reality was that gave rise to these experiences, I do not know. So here is somebody that I would definitely not call an evangelical Christian. Is that right to say, Dr. Evans? But a very respected, he wrote Paul and Palestinian Judaism, a very respected scholar, said, without a doubt, these disciples had experiences of seeing the Lord. What about the late, also died, 2021, Gerrit Ludemann, made famous, he's the one who famously came up with the mass delusion hypothesis, that everybody was like tripping on acid at the same time, and that's how you can explain the resurrection. It was a mass delusion, except there's no credibility for that in the scientific community. But Ludemann does help us, and again, this man, I think we should call him probably an atheist. He's not anymore, because he died in 2021. He said it may be taken as historically certain that Peter and the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ. So here we have an atheist who's literally saying it's certainty. These people had experiences of seeing him alive. Anthony Flew, and praise God for my good friend Gary Habermas, who just was such a good friends with Anthony Flew, who moved from atheism to monotheism, and then theism, I should say, from atheism to theism, and let's hope and pray to Christianity. Here's what Flew had to say about the evidence for the resurrection. The evidence for the resurrection is better than for claimed miracles in any other religion. It's outstandingly, and scholars don't use these kind of words flippantly. It's outstandingly different in quality and quantity. That's Anthony Flew, pretty powerful. Let's skip ahead because I want to go. We've seen the Alex Samanos. I want to skip ahead to some questions I get on the shroud, which is so phenomenal. We'll go past the wound patterns. I want to show the path of the shroud. I get this question a lot and often don't have time to discuss it. Isn't this a helpful slide? 38 of the 58 pollen spores on the shroud are from the land of Jerusalem. By the way, pollen everywhere here in Houston. Have you noticed that? I've got it on my shoes, got it in my eyes. Well, there's pollen on the shroud. And when you walk the shroud, you'll see that 38 of the 58 pollen spores are from the land of Jerusalem. Max Fry, a criminologist, spent 5 years of his life studying all 58 pollen samples, spores. And guess where the other 20 come from? Oh, big surprise. All the places we know the shroud has been the last 2,000 years. That's where the other 20 arise from. Constantinople, Istanbul. By the way, I gave a talk recently on Eastern Orthodoxy. 2 things I appreciate about Greek Orthodox and 7 reasons I'm not a Greek Orthodox. One thing I really appreciate about the Greek Orthodox Church, there's several, but there's also 7 reasons I'm not, to be clear, a Greek Orthodox. But they probably protected the shroud for 1,000 years. Let's not forget that. From the Islamic conquest, in many ways, we need to give credit where credit's due. And the shroud belongs to the unified church. That's something I want to say as I wrap up. It doesn't belong to any specific church. It belongs to the unified body of Christ. Next, let's show this. This is another thing that, again, I want to and go ahead and hit play. Let's watch this. This is what happens at the resurrection, okay? This should be an animation that you can hit play in. Maybe it's not. Maybe I put the wrong slide in there. But I wanted to show how the body essentially emanated through the shroud. So Jesus did not stand up and pull off his grave clothes. His body has otherworldly deathlessness capabilities to it, and it emanates through the shroud. How many of you remember reading the Gospels that Jesus can appear in rooms without using the door? So we shouldn't be surprised that they see this beautiful burial shroud that's been unmoved. A couple of things moving forward. Let me just show this. Number 3, this is my top 5 reasons. Go ahead and skip to number 3. The carbon dating has been authoritatively shown to be utterly unreliable. My good friend Tristan Casablanca did the equivalent of a Freedom of Information Act, and he just published a book I highly recommend where he got the British Museum to finally release the raw data that they had suppressed for 27 years. I'll end with this, showing that the sample that was used which we can go to the next slide, the samples used was supposed to be 7 labs, it was only 3. There's a lot of corruption involved, and the sample they used is likely not even homogeneous with the shroud itself. So there's a 2019 Journal of Archaeometry article that clearly points these things out and the flaws in the CR14 dating. I say all that to say, many people, that's the only thing they appeal to of why they don't take the shroud seriously. It's because of the carbon dating, and that has been shown by these scholars to be completely erroneous. We've dated the shroud in 5 other ways that I write about in my book, including wide-angle X-ray scattering, waxis, which showed that the shroud has been getting old for 2,000 years. So, friends, my time is up, and so I want to honor the time of the symposium. Those are the best reasons to believe in the physical bodily resurrection of Jesus. As we close, I do want to say just 2 words. I am so grateful to Pastor Jim for having me. Thank you, Pastor Jim, so much for inviting me back. Thank you for having me. I also want to say how much I love this church. If you don't have a church home, you need to make Grace Fellowship your church home. I also want to thank Dr. Scott Stripling for inviting me to participate and having a vision for this week with Pastor Jim. Can we give Dr. Stripling a huge round of applause? Thank you, Dr. Stripling. I just want to say, I want to put a plug in here. I wish I could go back and I'm jealous of you guys. I mean, to be able to be in seminary with Dr. Evans and Dr. Stripling, I'm just really jealous, and I'm going to leave you with that. I wish I could do it again because you're learning from the greats, truly the best of the best. And then finally, please pray me home. I have 3 9-year-olds at home right now, and I think they're driving Ruby insane. They probably have her locked up in a closet somewhere. So we are going to get on the road and get home. I've got an engagement tomorrow with Frank Turek, so I would just ask for you to pray for me this week. This is a big week for all of us, and thank you again. It's been such a delight to minister with all of you, and I know I speak on behalf of Audrey, just how grateful we are to you, Pastor Jim, to Lisa. Thank you guys so much for having us. So love you guys. Thank you very much.